There are moments in history when everything feels absolutely ordinary, right up until it isn't. April 25th of 1892 began like any other day in Paris. Inside a modest restaurant along Boulevard Magenta, patrons gathered for food, conversation, and the familiar comfort of routine. Plates were set down, voices overlapped in a quiet conversation, and the steady rhythm of service moved without any interruption. Nothing about the room suggested that within moments it would become the site of one of the most shocking acts of violence in the city's recent memory. To understand what happened inside that restaurant, you have to step back in time and look at the tension building beneath the surface of Paris at the time. The late 19th century was a period of deep unrest across Europe, and France was no exception. Economic inequality, political frustration, and growing distrust of authority had created an environment where radical ideas were beginning to take root. Among these ideas was anarchism. It was a movement that rejected traditional power structures and viewed the state, its police, and its institution as tools of oppression. For many involved in the movement, the struggle was not theoretical, it was very personal. Events like the Fourme shooting, where demonstrators demanded better working conditions, were fired upon, and the Cliché affair, where, where suspected anarchists were arrested and harshly treated, they tend to fuel a sense of anger that went beyond the protest. For some, these events justified escalation. Violence, in their views, was no longer a question of morality, but necessity. Into this environment stepped a man known as Ravachol, a figure who would become both infamous and symbolic. He carried out a series of bombings, targeting figures associated with the justice system, particularly those involved in prosecuting anarchists. His action made him a wanted man, but also in certain circles, a kind of martyr figure. His story spread quickly, and with it, a narrative that framed him as someone fighting back against a system that was seen as unjust. And then came the moment that would set everything else into motion. Ravachol entered the restaurant Le Valley as an ordinary customer. There was no spectacle, no warning, no dramatic reveal. No, nothing like that. He just sat down and ate. And for a brief time, he blended into the everyday life of the city. But he was recognized. An employee identified him, and the owner, Jean-Marie Valley, made a decision that would define his fate. He reported Ravachol to the authorities, leading directly to his arrest, of course. From a distance, that decision might seem fairly simple. Here was a man who was reporting a known and wanted criminal. But in the charged atmosphere of Paris at that time, this was a lot more than just a man reporting a criminal. To those sympathetic to Ravachol and his cause, Valley was no longer just a restaurant owner. He was an informant, and in their eyes, that made him a legitimate target. What followed was not immediate, but it was deliberate. Within anarchist circles, discussions turned inward toward retaliation. The idea of revenge began to take shape, not as an impulsive reaction, but as a calculated response. Among those who would act on this idea were three particular men: Théodule Meunier, Jean-Pierre Francois, and Fernand Bricot. They were not random individuals. They were connected through shared beliefs, shared frustrations, and a willingness to act. The plan they developed was as simple as it was devastating. There would be no confrontation, no warning, no attempt at any kind of negotiations. Instead, they were going to strike in a way that would ensure maximum impact with minimal risk to themselves. A bomb would be placed inside the Valley restaurant where Ravachol had been identified, targeting the man that they believed responsible for his capture. And on April 25th of 1892, that plan was put into motion. Monnier and Francois entered Les Vallées carrying a case that did not attract attention. In a busy restaurant, people tend to come and go. Objects are set down and picked up, and nothing about that behavior stood out. They moved through the space, placed the case near the counter, and left. Moments later, the explosion tore through this restaurant. The force of it shattered the calm of the room, sending debris flying and leaving destruction in its wake. Jean-Marie Velli was killed, along with another victim, and at least one other person was injured. What had been an ordinary setting became a scene of chaos in an instant. The immediate aftermath was filled with confusion, fear, and a sense of urgency. Authorities moved quickly, aware that this was not an isolated act, but part of a broader pattern of escalating violence. The bombing was not just an attack on an individual, on Jean-Marie. It was a message, one that reflected the growing intensity of the conflict between anarchists and the state. But this is where the story takes a turn that very few would have expected. The men involved in the attack did not remain united for long. Fernand Bricot, one of the conspirators, made a decision that cut against everything the attack had supposedly stood for. He cooperated with the police. Along with his partner, he provided information that shifted blame onto his accomplices, effectively dismantling the unity of the group from within. In a moment that placed such a strong emphasis on loyalty and shared purpose, this was a striking contradiction. The same ideology that had justified the violence against an informant like Jean-Marie now produced one of its own. The line between loyalty and survival blurred, and in that moment, the narrative of the attack changed. The investigation that followed led to arrests and trials and a series of outcomes that did not follow a simple or predictable pattern at all. Meunier was eventually sentenced to life penal labor and deported to a colony in Cayenne, where he would die many years later. Francois, despite his involvement, was acquitted by a jury. Bricot, who had cooperated with the authorities, still received a lengthy sentence of hard labor. So justice in this case did not align neatly with any kind of expectations. Cooperation did not guarantee freedom. Involvement did not guarantee conviction. The results reflected a complexity of the situation where ideology and evidence and circumstance all played a role in shaping the outcome. Beyond the individuals involved, the bombing had a broader impact on Paris and on France as a whole. It intensified fears, it hardened attitudes, and it contributed to a period known as the Era of Attacks, which is a time marked by a series of violent incidences linked to anarchist movements. Public reaction, of course, was strong, and the condemnation from authorities and increased efforts to prevent further attacks. Yet, even as the state responded with greater force, the underlying tensions that had led to the violence still remained. The bombing did not resolve the conflict. It amplified it. And that brings us to the deeper question at the heart of the story. What begins as a clear line between right and wrong can quickly become blurred when viewed through the lens of belief, fear, and survival. The restaurant owner believed he was doing the right thing by reporting a criminal. The attackers believed they were justified in seeking revenge. One of them later chose self-preservation over loyalty. Each decision, taken on its own, might be understandable. Together, they created a chain of events that led to tragedy. History often remembers the explosion, the violence, the immediate consequences. But that's just as important are the choices that led up to that moment and the choices that followed. They reveal how quickly situations can escalate, how fragile alliances can be, and how difficult it is to control the outcomes of actions once they're set into motion. So here's the question for you this time, and I want you to answer this in the comments. When loyalty to a cause conflicts with personal survival, which one do you think people truly choose when the pressure is at its highest? And have you ever been in a similar situation where you had to put survival and loyalty head to head? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.